Dr. Brian Fikkert is a professor of economics and community development and the founder and president of the Chalmers Center for Economic Development at Covenant College. He earned a PhD in economics from Yale University, specializing in international economics and economic development. Brian, it's an honor to call you friend and to be able to interview you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you. Love what Crown is doing. God has used Crown over many, many years all over the world, and we're just so excited to be part of this event in this small way.
You know, when we talk about alleviating poverty without hurting ourselves, you've said that it isn't simply a lack of material stuff. What's a more holistic definition of poverty?
Yeah, so what is poverty is really the starting point. Because when you ask most Americans, what is poverty, they'll say this. Poverty is about a lack of food, or lack of clothing, a lack of shelter. And of course, that is part of poverty. But when you ask the poor, both in the US and around the world, the same question, what is poverty? They'll often say something like this. I feel less than human. I feel shame. I feel like I'm garbage that everybody wants to get rid of. I don't feel like I have any voice. I don't feel like I can affect change in my life. So we tend to define poverty as a lack of stuff, and they tend to define poverty in far more psychological and social terms. And that disconnect between how they're experiencing it and how we're thinking about it is really at the heart of the problem. We've got to get the diagnosis correct. So what we do when Helping Hurts is just draw on the writings of other people. We don't claim that this is our own insights. And we think we're drawing on Scripture as well. We really ask the question, what is a human being? What is a human being? Because when that woman walks into your church asking for help with her electric bill, we have to know who she is, how she's wired, how has God created her to be if we want to actually help her. And so when we see a person lacking material things, it's typically a symptom of the underlying brokenness in the relationships. And so we've got to stop treating the symptoms and get down to the underlying brokenness.
And those relationships are with God, creation, self, and others?
Yeah,
that's the holistic view.
Yeah. And so if I have a broken relationship with creation and I'm poor, it might be the case that I'm not working hard, or it might be the case that I'm unemployed because of systemic problems. There's something that's undermining my ability to relate to creation in the way that God designed. A relationship that says work to bring honor and glory to God, and as a result of that, you'll be able to eat and sustain yourself and share with others. And so that's just one example. Broken relationship with others. You know, if you've ever spent time in a homeless shelter, so many people in the homeless shelter are just like me. Type A personalities, very driven, very idealistic, and something went wrong. Maybe they had a strain in their marriage, for example. Something goes wrong in the relationship with others typically, and they turn to alcohol to deaden the pain, and then they're in a downward spiral and they can't get out of it. And so that leads to material poverty, but the real issue is the relationship to the other that caused it.
Yeah. So we think a lot about stewardship of resources, and in your work, your premise is that outside resources should complement the local resources. Explain the thinking behind relief versus rehabilitation versus development.
One of the big challenges for those of us who've been blessed with material resources is to know how to use those material resources wisely. And so the Scriptures command us to be generous. They command us to give our resources away. But God isn't mindless. God is a generous God, but He's not mindless. He's always directing His work towards a particular purpose. And that purpose is the restoration of all things. And that's true for all of creation, but it's true for individuals too, that God is restoring us to what He's created us to be. And so our giving, our generosity ought to be in the direction of restoration as well. Restoration to humanness, again, restoration to living appropriately in those four key relationships. So often our giving actually undermines humanness. It underlines the wholeness in those four key relationships. And so we've got to ask ourselves, am I giving in such a way that's promoting human flourishing, that's helping people to be all they've been created to be? And that shows up in the issue of relief and rehab and development. Not all poverty is created equal. So as we start to think about how do we restore people to what it means to be fully human, we have to ask ourselves, what's the underlying condition? Relief is a handout. Relief is when I give you something or do something for you, and that's the appropriate intervention when a person or a community is in a crisis. But once the bleeding is stopped, we want to enter into what's called rehabilitation, which is restoring the individual or the community to the pre-crisis conditions. It's helping them get back on their feet to where they were before the crisis. And once you're in the rehab phase, you stop doing things to people or for people, and you start doing things with people. You ask them to contribute something to their own recovery. Why? Because we're stingy, uptight people? No. It's because we love them. And love means wanting people to be all that God's created them to be. And the third idea is development. Development is helping the individual or the community achieve higher levels of human flourishing than they've ever experienced before. Development isn't done to people or for people, it's done with people. It's saying, what gifts and abilities has God given you? What do you think God has called you to do? How could you use your gifts and abilities to achieve that calling? How could I walk with you in that process? And so you bring in outside resources, but only in ways that complement their use of their own gifts and their own resources.
And is development a more long-term view?
Development, it's a much longer-term view. It's much harder to do. Relief is easy. Americans love relief work because we don't like relationships. Development is a long, hard process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Much harder. But here's the real rub. The vast majority of poor people in the world are not in a crisis. The vast majority of poor people in the world are not completely incapacitated. They can actually do something. They're not in a crisis, they're in a chronic state of poverty. And so the appropriate intervention for most poor people is actually development. But what happens is we do relief in contexts that call for development. In the process, we undermine dignity, we undermine capacity, we undermine image bearing, we do more harm than good. That's the problem.
One of the things when I think about potentially harming others, we get all fired up and we want to serve and we want to go out there, and sometimes we just embarrass ourselves. I mean, I've embarrassed myself.
Me too.
I remember teaching to a group of people, lecturing them. I passed out this brochure and asked them to fill in the blanks. Well, they clapped and thanked me for coming, only to find out not only couldn't they write, they couldn't read the book that I had given them. And it was super embarrassing to me. So how do we help people without taking the wrong approach?
Yeah. I mentioned that poverty is rooted in broken relationships, but all of us are suffering from broken relationships. They just manifest themselves differently. What happens, do you think, when people who have a sense of pride interact with people with a sense of shame? That's a bad mix. The way that we are broken tends to exacerbate the way that the materially poor are broken. We rush in, we take over, and so we've got to have an entirely different approach that says, you know what, I'm broken, this other person is broken, but Jesus isn't broken. And so poverty alleviation isn't so much about me putting food in the hands of a beggar. Sometimes that's important. It's more about grabbing the hand of the beggar and saying, I'm broken and you're broken, but Jesus isn't. And let's go feed on him together. And so it's a posture that's rooted in the gospel. It's a posture that's rooted in humility. It's a posture that's rooted in the entire biblical narrative. Creation, person is created good. Fall, something's gone wrong here. Redemption, Christ is reconciling all things, and I can walk with this person as Christ does his reconciling work. So it's a posture of discovering the gifts, fanning the flames of the gifts, and of mutual brokenness that Jesus is addressing. It's just the gospel. My view is that poverty alleviation is fundamentally about trying to replicate the conditions of the Garden of Eden. No, don't panic. That sounds like a hard thing, doesn't it? But the human being is actually wired in a certain way, and God put the human being in a habitat where that kind of creature could flourish.
Yeah.
Right? And there's some qualities we know about the Garden of Eden. One of the qualities is community. Adam and Eve had deep community with one another. And so, and then the image of the restored creation is an image of restored Eden, the new heavens and new earth. One of the qualities of that is going to be that God is with his people, we're together. And so as we design our poverty alleviation interventions, part of replicating the conditions of Eden is creating community. It's central to human flourishing. And so in the space of microfinance, for example, some people do individual loans. We are very much into group loans, group savings, because you need the community to replicate the conditions of Eden. Our theology needs to shape how we actually work with the poor.
Well, totally. And our joy comes from community.
It does.
And not from the money, not from wealth creation, but relationships with one another.
Yep.
Brian, what concluding message would you have for those who really want to help stimulate human flourishing and have maximum impact?
Yeah. So a dear friend of mine who is a very generous, very wealthy individual, I was at a conference with him a number of years ago, and the conference was all about measuring the impact of poverty alleviation, all kinds of metrics. I'm an applied statistician. I was like, this is like, nirvana for me. And a study was presented that suggested that particular intervention hadn't been very effective. And this gentleman funded that particular ministry. And I looked at him and I said, Steve, are you devastated? He said, no. He said, I don't need any of that stuff. He said the statistics. He said, Brian, it's very simple. God plus community plus time equals transformation. I would modify it slightly. I would say God plus community plus work as worship plus time equals transformation. Create the conditions of Eden. Relationship to God, self, dignity, others, community, work as worship. If you can get those four things, God plus community plus dignity plus work plus time, good things happen.
Brian, thank you so much for being with us.
It's been a joy to be with you, Chuck. I'm so thankful for you, for all the incredible staff at Crown. So thankful for your work with the Christian Economic Forum. God's using you in a powerful way all over the world, and it's a joy to be with you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.